Hello everyone, this is Randy Ellefson. I am the author of the Art of Worldbuilding book series, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the travel template that is part of Creating Places, which is volume 2. There are a lot of details that are explained in the book, but you can download this template for free by joining the Art of Worldbuilding newsletter. And even if you haven't downloaded it, you can still follow along, and it may be something that you decide to get after watching the video. So you can see the spreadsheet now. The first sheet is the schema sheet, and that's what we're going to go over first. The first part of the schema sheet that we're going to go over is in the top left corner, and it has two columns that we care about. In column A is the inches on our map, and column B is the number of miles that this corresponds to. Now in my cases, I went with inches, and I decided to go with a 1/4 inch increment. So you can see in the second column, the first column, A2, it's at 1/4 inch, and then after that it's a 1/2 inch at line 3, and so on down the line here. The next column over is the number of miles, and I have decided that the scale of my map is that a 1/4 inch is 20 miles, and that is in green on there. And one of the notes you see to the right of this is that on this sheet, the green cells are the ones you should change for your needs. Leave the others alone unless you know how to change formulas and you think they need to be changed. So in this case, let's say you have decided that you want a different scale, like 30. Once I type into here, you'll watch all the numbers below this column change. So they're all going to do the math for you. Personally, I don't like doing math, so I think this is great, and this is one of the advantages of spreadsheet programs. I'm going to set this back to 20 for our demonstration, and this is what I personally use. Now, if you were to look up in the formula bar up here, you'll see that I actually typed a 20 in there. But the next one, I did not type 40 there. There's actually a formula calculating this for me, and that formula basically says take B2, which is the green cell, and multiply it by 2, because of course a 1/2 inch is twice as long as a 1/4 inch. So that is basically the way this whole section all the way down goes. I can briefly click on these if you're curious. If you don't have Excel and you can't use the spreadsheet, you can duplicate the same thing in something else like Google Sheets. So it's not that hard to figure out how to do this. And that's basically all that we have here on this particular portion of this. The next part of the schema sheet that I want to talk about is the base miles per day, which I also abbreviated as BMPD, and the number of miles lost due to the terrain that we are traveling over. So in row 16, we see the travel mode is foot, and then the next line down is riding horse, and then war horse, or a lightly encumbered war horse, on down to wagons, dragons, and carrier pigeons. And the green column there, the BMPD, this is the base miles per day. I did a lot of research into this, and you are free to do your own and to disagree with my numbers here and change them to your liking. But these numbers are basically typed right in there. So this is something, and again, the green area is the areas where you should go ahead and type in different values if you disagree with what I have researched and I've input for my own needs. But this is your basic base miles per day, and this will be used along with the inches on your map and the number of miles for your scale to calculate a lot of things for you. So let's take a look at the next set of columns, starting here with road. We've got road, plain, which basically means a grassland, then light forest, heavy forest, hills, mountains, and deserts. And I want to briefly talk about what I mean by these. And to some extent that's kind of obvious, but by road, I basically mean it's flat land and it is paved. By a plain, I basically mean it's flat land, but it does not have a paved road. So it won't even have a trail. It might just be dirt or grasslands. By forest, that means that there is no trail or a road, because both of those would function as either the road or plain columns. In other words, there is underbrush that interferes with horses and people to different degrees and also makes wagon travel impossible, for example. Hills and mountains may include the presence of a road, and they are generally difficult even without one. Desert means sandy terrain. Most desert terrain is actually hard rock like concrete and should be treated as if it's a road. Generally on this chart, 24 hours in a day are assumed, but 8 of those being travel time while not rushing and taking ample time to rest. There are more explanations about some of this in the Creating Places book. Depending on our travel mode, Some of these terrains are ideal and others will cause us to lose a certain amount of speed and therefore a number of miles that we can travel in a day. So for example, column or row 16, going by foot, you can see road and plain, it's basically 0. That means we wouldn't really lose any time while traveling this way. And in fact, anywhere on this chart, if you see a 0, that basically indicates that is the ideal terrain for us to travel over. So for example, horses do really well on a plain, but they actually lose a little bit of time on roads. And the reason for that is that the roads are harder and it's not a natural surface. Of course, we invented roads. On the other hand, the hard earth, that's still not as hard as a road like concrete or cobblestones. So basically a road is a little bit fatiguing to a horse. So this has been taken into consideration on this chart. So you can see row 18, the horse would lose roughly 2.8 miles per day out of the 28. So this is just a formula where I'm multiplying that by 0.1. We can't see the formula on the screen right now, but basically that's what's happening. There are little modifiers for each of these calculations to reduce the amount of speed that we have and therefore the number of miles. And again, this is something where you can disagree with what I have done. If you've got the spreadsheet, you can click into any one of these cells and see what the formula is up in the formula bar. I also have notes, which you can tell the existence of by these little red triangles. So for example, this note on the heavy forest line on row 16 says, in heavy forest, you're losing 2/3 of your speed. And the reason for that is that you would have to be hacking through the underbrush. There's no road for you to travel, and there's too much underbrush for you to just bypass everything. You're going to have to cut your way through it or keep finding your way around. You're probably going to lose a lot of speed, and therefore your number of miles per day will be significantly reduced. I'm not going to go over every last one of these formulas, but what I will say is if you see a gray cell, that means it doesn't apply. So for example, row 21 and 22 with dragons and carrier pigeons, well, what use do they have for a road? And the answer is probably none. I mean, sure, they may be walking along one. I suppose it's possible, but most of us aren't really going to be looking at that. You know, we're looking at scenarios where they're flying, so certain things are ruled out. Now, some people will think that mountains pose no problems for birds, but the reality is that on Earth, there are birds that really struggle to get over the really tall mountains like the Himalayas, like Mount Everest. So they would actually lose a certain amount of time. So some of this is calculated in here. Again, if you want to change any of the values in here, all you have to do is type over a different number. Some of them have formulas, so I would always check to see what the formula is and if there is a formula in one of them and understand what it's doing. For the most part, they're taking a value like this 28 for light warhorse and they're multiplying that by a modifier. So in fact, let's look at the foot row. For your base miles per day, that's going to be 12. There's no modifier for this or for road or for plains, so there's nothing in there. I just typed a 0 in there. For light forest, I have you losing about 15% of your speed. So the formula is B16, which is the column here in green, times 0.15. And then the next one over for heavy forest, again, it's B16, your base miles per day, multiplied by 0.66. And I have these rounding up, or down actually, depending on where it is, but you know, so you can see each of these formulas, they're just rounding the numbers and they're multiplying the base miles per day by a modifier that is in each one of those cells. And that's kind of all there really is to this particular area of the Excel spreadsheet on the schema sheet. So just to quickly recap, this is the schema sheet as you can see on the bottom here. And this has two sections to it, the inches on the map and the miles for your scale, and then the base miles per day and the miles lost due to terrain on the bottom. These two sections are not interacting with each other. Both of them are used by the other sheets that we will cover. And some of those explanations that I read off to you before are on the right side here, where I explain what I mean by a road or a plain so that you can understand that and there are no assumptions about what is going on. The next sheet that I want to focus on is the manual travel sheet, and it's called this because you will be manually figuring out how long it takes to get from one place to another, but the advantage of this sheet is that you don't really have to do much, if anything, with all the formulas and calculations that are on here because they are basically already set for you. And that is a lot easier than one of the other alternatives that we are going to look at in a minute. So I want to focus your attention on the top left area of this, which is from row 1 down to row 14. You can see in row 1, it says traveling on a paved road or flying straight. But down here in row 16, it says traveling on an unpaved road or on the grass. And if we were to scroll down, we have more of these, like traveling in a light forest with no direct road, traveling in a heavy forest, traveling over hills, over mountains, over desert and swamp. And you should recognize these from the schema sheet. These are the different types of terrain that we have and what may happen to us as far as the modifiers that are going to impact how fast we can travel. So I'm only going to explain this first section at the top here, but all of the other ones are basically doing the same thing. They're just using a different terrain modifier. The first one we're looking at, as you can see from row 1, is the paved road one. So if you remember from our schema sheet, we had our inches. We were doing a 1/4 inch as our increment, and you can see it just goes down the list just like before. And then this 20, I did not type a 20 in there. As you can see from the formula, what this is actually doing is referring to the schema sheet. B2 is where that 20 is coming from. So the reason we do this is that if we change our mind about our scale, we want this to update for us. So for example, if I go ahead and click on the schema sheet and I change this value to 30, you'll see all the values below that change. But if I go back to this other sheet, look, it has also changed here. So this allows us to change our minds, and all of these calculations that you see in this whole section are going to be redone for us. Personally, I hate math. You're probably going to hear me say this more than once because it's true, and I like saying that. I like hating math. So this is one of the great things about spreadsheets. Now I'm going to go back here to the schema sheet and change this back to 20 for our example. And of course, all the numbers there changed. And now all the numbers here changed. Again, if you look at this formula, the way to read this, ignoring the rounding function for the moment, it's saying, look at the schema sheet, and then there's an exclamation point, and then look at the field B2. That's the B column, the second row. The comma 0 is part of this round function. I'm basically rounding the numbers up or down, depending on how it chooses to round things. So now these are whole numbers, so it's relatively easy. So the next column over is the kilometers. This is, you can see the formula at the top here. It's basically taking the previous value, which is in this case B4, right there you see B4, and it's multiplying that times the accepted standard for figuring out what the kilometers are. So if you prefer to do things in kilometers, this will tell you what the 20 miles actually results in, which in this case is 32.2 kilometers. Now, as far as these other columns go, you can see that if you're traveling on foot, it'll take you 1.7 days to do this. And this formula is a little bit more complicated. What it's doing is it's taking the schema sheet, column B16, which is our base miles per day, and it is subtracting the schema sheet C16, which is our modifier. So let's go back to the schema sheet. We're looking at B16 and C16. Well, where is that? So here is B16, and of course it's doing B16 minus C16. In other words, take the base miles per day, or our basic travel number of miles, and subtract our modifier. In this case, that happens to be 0. So the end result, of course, is going to be 12. Some of the other calculations, while we're on here, they're going to take base miles per day, and they're going to subtract the modifier for planes. Or it's going to take base miles per day and subtract the modifier for forest light or forest heavy. So for example, in forest heavy, instead of it being 12, it's going to be 12 minus 8, which is going to be 4. That's what this is doing. So now we're back on the manual travel sheet. So what this says is schema 16, or B16, which is traveling by foot, base miles per day, minus schema sheet C16, which is when traveling on a road. And then it's taking B4, which is our number here, the 20 miles, and dividing it by that value. In this case, this is B16 is 12, C16 is 0. So in other words, this basically says 20 divided by 12. And the result of that calculation is 1.7. These other cells are basically doing the same thing. If you look at the formula as I tab across here, in the first column of the traveling by foot, it's B16 and C16, then it's B17 and C17, and so on across the top. Now the thing is, you don't really need to understand too much about this formula. Now here you see there's less of a formula. If you remember from the other sheet, dragons don't travel on road typically, so I had that section grayed out. So there's no real formula here, it's just grabbing the base miles per day. In this case, it would take so little time for a dragon to go 20 miles that it wouldn't even take like an hour. Same for a carrier pigeon. So if we go back over here, you can see it's basically the same thing going all the way down, or all the way across and all the way down. So you can see at a glance how long it would actually take to get anywhere by these different travel modes across the top based on the distance that we've set on our scale. That's pretty much all that's going on here. You don't need to ever modify any of this. If you don't like the numbers that are on here, you can of course fudge them, or you can go back to the schema sheet. Maybe you've decided that humans can walk reliably more than 12 hours a day. You don't change anything on this sheet. You go back to the schema sheet and you change the values there. If you decide that the amount of modifiers is also different, you again change the schema sheet and all these values will change for you. Each of these sections on the left here, like this one, is basically the same as the one below, except they are each using a different modifier. So the question then is, how do we go about using this? And the answer is, I want to call your attention to this area of the screen over here. Let's say that our characters are doing a journey and we have decided that they're going to travel on road for about a 1/4 inch based on our measurement. Well, we can see over here that a 1/4 inch is 20 miles, so we just manually type 20 into this. And we can also see that kilometers is 32.2, so we type that in. And then let's say we have decided they will be riding horses, and these are not war horses, they're just kind of regular riding horses. And we can see that this will take 0.6 of a day. So there you go. So now we have that value in there. But let's say they are also traveling over hills, and on our map, the distance is a 1/2 inch. Well, we don't want paved road, we don't want unpaved road. We're going to have to scroll down to traveling over hills. So here's the traveling over hills section, and they're going to travel, we basically want these values here, which is 40 miles, 64.4 kilometers, and since we're on horse, we want 1.6. Let's see how good my memory is. Type in 40 here, 64.4, and then 1.6. So what did this get us? Well, if you look at the total row, we can see it's 3/4 of an inch on our map, which of course we don't particularly care about. But what we do care about is it's 60 miles, it's almost 100 kilometers, and on horse, it's going to take just over 2 days to make this trip. That is how you use this particular sheet on here. All you have to do, you don't have to change these sections over here at all. All you have to do is type in the numbers over here and it gets you your rough travel distance. So there is an advantage to this, and that is not having to do much with formulas. The disadvantage is, as you can see, whatever trip this is from city 1 to town 2 or whatever, we are not really keeping a permanent record of this travel time. Now, we may not care about that, but it is something that I'm just going to point out. We don't have a consistent record of this, even if we write this down somewhere. And of course, if we change our mind, all the numbers would have to be redone. So even if we did write it down somewhere, that would become useless if we decide that our scale is actually 30 miles for a 1/4 inch. So that's the only disadvantage to doing this. I think that for most people, this spreadsheet is probably a lot easier and more sensible than the next one that we are about to go over. All right, now we come to the most fun part of this, and that is the other travel sheet. This is not for the faint of heart. There's an old expression that comes to mind: abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. It's really not that bad, but it kind of can be. Right now it doesn't look too bad because of course everything has been zeroed out. What I want to point your attention to first is that I've got a couple blue bands here, like at row number 2. These are cities that are not part of a kingdom, and then we would have the kingdom of wherever, the kingdom of nowhere. I tend to break this up into manageable chunks. And then, of course, we have our start and destination columns, which are A and B here. So city 1 to city 2, city 1 to city 3, and so on. And then we have our inches over terrain type. That's what this is. This is our measurements from our map. So maybe it's, let's say, 0.25 miles between these two locations, and down here we'll say it's 1 mile. Excuse me, not 1 mile, 1 inch. I'm just going to add some numbers here. I'm going to go with 1 inch on my map here, 0.75 there. I'll go with a 0.5 there, and another 0.5 here. So as you can see, as I did this, these filled in, and all they're doing, these are adding up these rows over here. If I click on the formula, you can see it's just literally adding up everything over there. So if I go down, you can see obviously I typed a 1 over here, and that's 1. If you take 0.5 and add it to 1.25, you end up with this 1.75. So this part is relatively simple. All we would do to fill this out is to go to our map, or if we don't have a map, just make it up, and decide how far apart all of these are to come up with our scale. And this gray column, we don't want to alter this. We also don't want to alter these other gray columns. These have formulas in them that are doing some of the math for us. And this section of this is relatively easy to complete. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple other numbers here from my example, which is off screen. So this is the easier part of this. And that's pretty much all there is to this section. Okay, it's time to focus on the next section of this, which is basically this area here. We want to fill out all of this. Now I've added something on the bottom here, and this is the formulas that we want to use. What this is saying is take the schema sheet, B2, and we're going to use that formula in this area. I'll show you what I mean in a second, but if you remember, schema sheet B2 is 0.25 inches. So for example, if I go to the schema sheet, here is B2. It corresponds to 20 miles. We want to use this formula so that if we change our mind about that scale, it'll still work and it'll update things for us. So basically what I want to do is take this formula right here, and everywhere I had a 25, right? Here we have 20.25. Well, here's a 0.225. So what I want to do is paste that formula right in there. And there it goes. And so you see it's showing 20. I could have pasted a 20 in there, but the problem is if I ever change my scale on the schema sheet, then I would have to come back and redo all these numbers, and we don't want to do that. So what I've done is I've just pasted that in there. And everywhere we see it 0.25, well, that was in planes, so we'll go over here in planes, and we'll paste that formula again. I'm just going to go ahead and look for all the 0.25s and paste that in here. There's another one there, so that would go here. And I think I got them all. Let's see, do I have any 0.5s? Yes, I do. So I'm going to grab that formula. And this was here, so I need a 0.5 there. And you can see I grabbed 40, which is correct. Oops, what happened here? Let me try that again. All right, we got a 40 there. Where's another 0.5? We got one here. That is hills, so I want to come over to here to hills. Paste it there. It looks like we got another one right after that. We've got one here. Paste it in there. I think that's all for that. Do we have any 0.75s? Yes, we do. So I'm going to select this, copy. 0.75 is on heavy forest. That's here. It's not up there anywhere. It's here again. So we're going to go to that. Do we have a 1? We do have a 1. We'll grab this. That was on planes, so we want it on planes here. Here it is on light forest, which is here. I think that's it for that. We've got a 1.25 over here, and there's another one up there. So we'll grab 1.25. That is on plains. I type that in there. Here it is on desert and swamps. We'll add that there. And we've got a 1.5, so we'll go down here and grab this one. Let's see here, any 1.5s up here? I don't see one. There's one here in plain. Go here. And there's one all the way down here. Oop. Didn't like that for some reason. Oh, I'm missing the equal sign. Now see, you got to be very careful with these. If you mess up something as simple as that, you get some really beautiful looking errors. So I didn't select enough of it when I did that. All right, so what we've got here, we've basically got all our distances in miles based on our scale. If you remember, a quarter inch is 20. Well, let's say for the sake of argument, I go back to schema sheet and I say, you know what, I want to make that 30. Now we come back here. All of these have changed, and so have all these other modifiers over here that we haven't talked about yet. But look at that. This is the big advantage to doing this. It can be a little bit difficult to set up, but it's not too bad. It's going to get worse in a minute, so just hang on. So, look, now we know how long it takes to, or how many miles all these things are, based on the terrain type. These two gray columns are miles and kilometers. And each one of these is basically adding up everything to the left. If I click in the formula cell, that's all it's doing. It's taking 20 plus 80, which is 100, and plus 60, and it results in, of course, 160. And then this formula has the standard one for figuring out how many kilometers it is. So there you go. That is all done for you. It's relatively simple, especially if you just go ahead and put in this little chart here. I probably should have given this to people. All I really did was I took this formula and then I copied and pasted it, and I kept changing the 3. You can see this is changing from B2 to B3, so on down the list, and then I changed this in a quarter-inch increments all the way down the list. I normally don't have this on here, but it was a little bit easier for my own sanity to explain this to you. So you can see now how many miles and kilometers it takes to get from one place to another. Let's talk about the part of this that we really care about, and that is this area over here where we talk about the days by travel mode. This has all of our modifiers in it. Now, some of you may have seen these numbers being filled out automatically. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work all by itself. The reason these worked is that I am looking at another version of the spreadsheet that has all of these other values already typed into it, and these have already been manually entered. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these because I want to show you how you have to actually fill these in. And this is the part that is a little bit frightening. Okay, now we come to the fun part of this. What we want to do is put in our modifiers over here. And here is the formula. I'm going to go ahead and copy this in there real quick and then explain this to you. So, what this is doing is essentially taking our K3. What's K3? Well, that's on this sheet. It's the road, because that's where our value is. And this is the third row, of course, right? So K3 divided by schema B16 minus schema C16. What is B16 on the schema sheet? That is our base miles per day, right? If we go down here, base miles per day for foot is 12. And here's our modifier. We're basically taking 12 minus, in this case, 0. That's what this says. B16 minus C16. And we're dividing K3 by that value. So K3 is 20, as you see up here, minus 12, because 12 minus 0 is still 12. And that gets us 1.7. Does that make sense? This is where this starts to get a little bit hairy. Unfortunately, all that got us was the one value. We want more values than that. Oops. Now look, what you see happening right now is one of the gotchas. I was inside a cell with a formula and I clicked somewhere else and it's trying to alter my formula. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. You have to be very careful with that kind of thing. All right, so how do we get the next column over? The riding horse? Well, we're going to take this formula and I'm going to do it here in this text box just so you can see. And what I want to do is change the 16 to 17 for both of these. And the reason, of course, is that I'm referring to the next cell over. So now I'm going to paste that in there, and that gets me the next value. We could do the same thing with the next one. We want to go to B18, and we would continue this operation across the way to find out, how long it would take us to get from one place to another by each different form of locomotion. I went ahead and jumped ahead a little bit and added the rest of the values for these two, but I want to just show you quickly what's happening. And I want to call your attention to this first value. The first column is by foot, and the numbers are 16, B16 and C16. As we move to the next column, the only change to this formula is that the numbers 16 and 16 go up by 17 and 17. And then we move one more column over and they go up one more to 18, and so on across the row. So this is relatively easy to accomplish. We just need to copy the formula and change that number from 16 to 17, 17 to 18, 19, and so on across the board. Now if we move down one row, we again want the same basic formula. Now you see it's still B16. Look, in this row, row 3, it's B16 and C16. Down here, it's also B16 and C16. So what has changed? Well, if I click on the first row of these, we're looking at K3 up here. Why K3? Well, because we have a value in K, row 3. Down on this one, we have a value in L, and we're on row 4. So we needed to change this to be L4 in order to do the calculation. And that's pretty much all that's really happening there. And otherwise we would again go from 16 to 17, 18, 19 across the board here. So this isn't too bad when there's only one number on our row. The fun stuff comes when we have two or more, as we are about to look at. Alright, now that we understand the basic principle of this, it's time to get a little bit more complicated. The basic idea of what we want to do is not that hard. The problem is that on our next line we have two values. So we basically need to add the calculation for this one to the calculation for that one. And what I've done here is I have already pasted the formula down here. At first glance, this is pretty ugly, but let's break it down. I'm going to add some line breaks here. The first part of this is what we were just looking at. We're looking at K5. Why K5? Well, because we have a value in the K column and we are now on row 5. So that's pretty simple. And again, we're looking at this is the formula for the foot column. So that is B16 and C16. B16 is our base miles per day. C16 is our modifier. You may remember this was 12 and this was 0. So K5 divided by 12. K5 is 40. So that's going to get us a certain value. Then we simply want to add that to this one, which is L5. Why L5? Well, we're still on the 5th row, right? And this time we have a value in the L column. And once again, we are dividing that by the same exact formula here. The base miles per day minus the modifier. So if I put that back on one line, and I copy all that, I'm going to go up here, and paste it. So now we see how long it would take to travel by foot 140 miles, given that 40 of those miles are on a road and 100 of them are on a plane. That is basically what we need to do for this kind of thing. It's a little bit more tedious and there's a lot of work involved in this, but it isn't that bad. If we wanted to do the next one over, the next column, we could duplicate this like I just did and change all the 16s to 17s. And now we can take this, select it all, copy that, paste that in there, and you can see this is how long it would take to go by a riding horse. We would essentially repeat the same operation going across. Does this make sense? It's a little bit confusing, but hopefully this video makes it a little bit easier to digest. For this next row, we would essentially do the same thing, but this time we are adding 3 of these together. By this point, some of you may be wondering, why would we do all of this? And I'm here to tell you that is not a fair question. No, I'm kidding. It's totally a fair question. And the answer is that if we ever decide to change our modifiers on the schema sheet or the scale, it will automatically change everything for us. So for example, if I change this 20 to 30, oops, well, 3020, that's not exactly what I had in mind. Let's go with 30. Now you see this all changed, but if we go back to here, all of this also changed for us, and we didn't have to redo any of our math. As I said before, I hate math, so this is great. So the question you need to ask yourself is, how likely are you to change your scale? If you don't have that much confidence in your scale, then this might be something that's worth doing, or if you just really like to play with Excel formulas, it's another thing to keep you busy. But I would be the first to admit this could certainly be considered overkill, and I did this extensively for one of my continents, and after a couple days I kind of wanted to poke my own eyes out. But I like being able to look at it, and at a glance I can see exactly how long it takes to get from one place to another, and I don't have to redo the math. I already did it once years ago. Now I will say that this is on my main world that I'm planning to use for the rest of my career, so maybe this was worth it, maybe it wasn't, who knows. But this is how this spreadsheet works if you decide to use it or not. Now that we've looked at one of the more complicated sheets, let's look at one of the easiest ones, and that is the travel by sea spreadsheet. This one needs no modification at all. What we have here again is our scale, which is 1/4 inch, is 20 miles. Of course, if we went to the schema sheet and we changed that, all these values and all the numbers on this would automatically change. And to prove that to you, go ahead and take a look at some of the numbers on here. Memorize them real quick. Don't blink. I'm going to switch to the schema sheet, change that to 30, come back, and boom, all the numbers just changed. Not just this column, but all the nautical miles, kilometers, everything else. It all just changed. I'm going to go back and switch that back just to do so. All right, so let's look at this again. So we've got our miles. That's pretty much done for us. Our nautical mile formula is also done for us. This is the formula up here. You basically want to take your miles and divide them by 1.151. And then we also have our formula for the kilometers. And then our next one over is nautical kilometers. Now, one of my readers was kind enough to point out to me that there's technically no such thing as nautical kilometers. I forget exactly what he said, but basically somebody tried to work this out and they couldn't get it to work. But I have left it on here anyway just for reference sake. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are doing things in miles or kilometers. These calculations over here are basically going to be the same because they're not really using those values. What is it doing? It's taking nautical miles, which in this case for 20 miles on land it would be 17.4 nautical miles, and we are dividing that by 2 because this is the 2 knots column. That's the speed that we are traveling at. If we were to move over to the next one, you'll see we are dividing by 4, right? Because that's the 4 knots column. Can you guess what's next? Yep, it's by 6, by 8, 10, 12, 14. That's all there is to this one. It's pretty simple. So this is done for you, and this will tell you how long it takes to get somewhere by ship. Okay, let's talk about another area of our spreadsheet, and that is the region calculator. What we're trying to do here is figure out how many square miles or square kilometers are in something like a continent or a given kingdom or even a forest or mountain range. We sometimes want to know this kind of thing, and one of the reasons is that we might want to say something like, he stood at the wall that was guarding the almost 200-mile length of the southern border. Well, how do we know that it's almost 200 miles? Well, in this case, I'm looking at line 7 here, where 2.25 inches on my map was 180 miles. So that gave me that distance. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. I'm going to start with line 7, which is kingdom number 1 name. Obviously, we would want to put the name of our actual kingdom there. So let's say that I have measured the length on the map, and it is 2.25 inches. And then I measured the height, and that was 2.5 inches. So the next thing I need to do is turn this into the number of miles. As you can see here, the C column is miles, D is kilometers. So what we want to do, as usual, is refer to the schema sheet. 2.25, if we click over to schema sheet, 2.25 is B10. That's the value we want. Of course, we could just copy 180, but it's a little bit more sensible to copy the formula for that cell and refer to the cell in case we change our minds. So that's how we get a 180 here. We didn't type 180, we referred to the schema B10 column, and we rounded it up or down. And we did the same thing. Well, actually, no, in this case, I didn't do that. I took that value there in C7, and I multiplied it by our formula for kilometers. And that was how I ended up with the number of kilometers that are on this particular border. I then did the same thing with the height. 2.25 is technically the B11 column from this schema sheet. And then, of course, we multiplied that by our kilometers to get the kilometers, and then we get to our square miles. This is relatively easy. We are taking C7 and multiplying it by F7. I'll get to the rest of this in later, but if I click in this cell, you can see we are multiplying this value times that value to get our square miles. Now you see I also have this multiplication by 0.8, and I'll explain that in just a second. But you can see over here we've done essentially the same formula for the square kilometers. We are multiplying this kilometer value times that kilometer value. So that's pretty much all there is to that. The one exception, as I mentioned, is why am I multiplying this value, where is it? This one here, this value by 0.8. Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that your whatever it is, whether it's a kingdom, a forest, or a mountain range, let's say by hypothetically it is exactly a square. Because why do we care about this? Well, because we're doing square miles. How likely is it that your territory is an actual square? And the answer is not that likely. There are some states in the United States that actually are a square or pretty close, and therefore you don't have to modify the number. You can actually take the length by the height on the map and multiply them, and that's it, you're done. But that's not how we are probably going to be doing this. So what I have here with this 0.8, in this made-up kingdom number 1 name, I have decided that if I were to take a square and I were to paste an image of this kingdom into that square, that it would not be an exact square. It wouldn't fill up the whole thing. It would only fill up about 80% of it. So therefore, I have modified my square miles by 0.8 to reduce by 20% the overall land area that is in that kingdom. This is not an exact science. Basically what I do is I look at any one of my kingdoms or a continent and I picture a square around it, and then I figure out, okay, how much of it appears to be not filling up that square. You know, I live in the state of Maryland. It's a bit of a funky shape. If I were to paste the state of Maryland into a square, I doubt we would even fill 50% of that square, so I might multiply that value by 0.5. In other words, 50% of this square is missing from my landmass. It's not an exact science, but we don't need to be exact because we're just world builders. We're not producing an atlas, or not real people who are going to be traveling on this world and get screwed up by our slightly off calculations. We want to be plausible and near to the mark. So that's what I'm doing here. We're taking the length miles, multiplying it by the height miles, and then we are multiplying that by a value that is our best guesstimate of how much land mass is actually missing from within that square. The rest of the examples on this screen are essentially done the same way, but I do want to talk about this line up here for the continent. We have 15 inches, but you may remember from my schema sheet, which I'm going to flip to now, I only went up to 2.75 inches. So how am I going to get this? Well, we're just going to use some more formulas. So if I click over to here, what I've done is I've taken B9 and I've multiplied it by 7. Why did I do that? Well, let's go look at what B9 on schema sheet is. B9 is 2, right? So what's 2 times 7? That gets me 14. But I need one more than that, so I'm probably going to need B9 times 2 for 14 plus B5. And as it turns out, that's exactly what my formula says. B9 times 7 gets me 14 plus B5. So that gets me my 15 inches. So the result is I have a length of 1,200 miles, or almost 2,000 kilometers. And I have a note on here, so you multiply 2 inches times 7 to get 14 inches, then add the 15th inch. So very clever of me, isn't it? I did the same thing with this. And that's pretty much the only difference between this line and the other ones, is that I had to do a little bit of funky math there with referring to my other sheet a couple different times. But this got me the square miles of my entire continent. Again, I probably did this issue of imagining that continent inside a square and then calculating how much I thought might be missing from that. Let's see, did I do anything? Yeah, in this case, the imaginary example, I decided that a quarter of that was technically missing. So that's all there is to this. It's not that hard. I wanted to wrap up with a few last comments about all of this measuring that we're doing. One of the things that comes up in world building is that we often want to get things right. But as I often say in my books and the podcast and everything else, there's really no such thing as getting it right most of the time. What we really want is to be plausible. And that's what this is about, really. Many of us have no idea how long it takes to get from one place to another by wagon, for example, because when was the last time we rode in a wagon for more than a few minutes at something like a hayride on a Halloween festival, for example? So this is the kind of thing that can help us get these realistic numbers. Now, some of us are going to be a little bit more rigid than others, and I would suggest in general that you just be flexible about it. We really just want to get ballparks. You know, if a journey needs to take slightly longer, then we just decide that someone is maybe a little bit injured and they can't walk as far, or their horse is fatigued and it can't travel as far, or maybe it's got a missing, I forget what to call it, on the hoof. You know, it's got a missing shoe on the hoof. You know, we can throw things out there to wiggle these things a little bit one way or another. And now, of course, my always favorite thing about this kind of stuff, my recommendation is don't get real specific and write hard numbers on this. We want to say something like, our map is not drawn to scale. This gives us plausible deniability. And I always like to joke that no one from our fictional world is going to show up on our planet here on Earth and tell our readers or our game players, he's got it wrong. He has no idea how long it actually takes to get from here to there. This is in the way, that's in the way. You know, this kind of thing always happens. There's bandits in that forest and they cause a problem. You have to go slow because you have to watch out for the danger. You know, none of that's going to happen. We're the god of this world that we are making up. Now, if we're writing a story that's set on Earth and we're doing some sort of fictional timeline, then yes, we are a little bit more restricted and we have more reason to try to get it right and not just plausible. But generally, we can go with numbers like this and not worry about it too much. Another comment I want to make is that you may disagree with my base miles per day, and you're certainly fine to do that. And as one example, I want to mention the Roman legions. From my research, they could do something like 14 to 20 miles a day. Now, I said on my schema sheet that we can do 12 miles a day. Well, basically what we're talking about here is that the Roman legions, these guys were trained and they were young and, you know, very hardy guys. So they could do it, but most of us in our modern life, we probably wouldn't do 20 miles in a day. Or if we did, and this is the important part, we would probably be laid up for a couple of days recovering. Many of us know that a marathon is a certain number of miles, 28 miles, something like that. I forget off the top of my head, sorry about that. But, so sure, someone can run those in about 3 or 4 hours, but they have to train for like a half year to do that. And then in the week after that, they're not doing much of anything because they're recovering from the fact that they just ran a marathon. So this is another thing I'm pointing out because we can fudge the numbers. If we need our characters to get somewhere in 5 hours, but our spreadsheets here say they can only do it in 4 hours, well, we can still have them do it in 5 hours. It's kind of like that idea to know your rules before you break them. This will give you a pretty good idea of things like how long it takes to get from one place to another by different forms of locomotion, how much time is lost due to various terrains, and then how big an area is, for example. And, being plausible is the bar that we need to get over. If you download this spreadsheet from the Art of World Building newsletter once you sign up and you find an error, please give me a shout out and let me know. I'm always likely to make some sort of error with this kind of thing. I'm going to say for the last time that I hate math. There are problems that come up with Excel spreadsheets where it does things with formulas that you aren't expecting. So anyway, just give me a shout out if there is an error in here. If you have another way of doing some of this, feel free to share that with me. I would love to learn from your expertise. And otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it helped you use this. And if you are someone who hasn't heard of the books, feel free to check them out. I've got a free book called 185 Tips on World Building that you can get off of Amazon or any other location, any store. And there's going to be some information in the description. I urge you to check it out. And thank you for watching. And I hope you found this helpful. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.